The thunderstorm raged outside, but it was the silence within the grand estate that unnerved Isabella more. As she stepped into the cavernous foyer, her heels echoed against the cold marble. Everything seemed as it should. The chandelier above glittered, casting fractured light across the walls, and the fire in the distant hearth crackled faintly. Yet the air felt wrong, charged with an unseen tension. Then she saw it. A bloodied envelope lay discarded on the floor, stark against the pale marble. Her heart stumbled as she bent down, the faint scent of copper filling the air. The initials embossed on the seal, M.V., were unmistakable. They belonged to him. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, the paper inside damp and sticky. The scrawled message was brief, but burned into her memory instantly. "Leave before he finds you. Tonight you choose life or death." She stumbled back, her breathing shallow. A muffled noise, like a footstep, echoed through the halls, and she whipped her head toward the sound. It couldn't be him. He was gone. Wasn't he? Isabella clutched the letter to her chest, the memories rushing in unbidden. A forbidden love that had consumed her, and the price she'd paid for daring to believe in it. But nothing compared to the icy dread curling through her veins now. What had she just walked into? And more terrifyingly, could she ever walk out? Let me know what you think, or if you'd like tweaks to match your vision. Here's a detailed draft for introducing the protagonist and their world. Introducing Isabella and her world. The rain hadn't let up in days. It streaked down the tall windows of Isabella Marlowe's townhouse, painting blurred shadows of the city beyond. The view, usually bustling with light and movement, was muted. A reflection of her own life, she thought bitterly as she turned away. Isabella wasn't one to brood. At least, that's what she told herself. She was a survivor. The kind of woman who knew how to pivot when life threw its cruel twists. But lately, surviving had started to feel like drowning, and no amount of controlled smiles or carefully chosen words could convince her otherwise. Her world was a carefully constructed facade. By day, she was a rising star in art restoration, her delicate hands breathing life into paintings forgotten by time. Her studio, a converted loft on the edge of the city, was her sanctuary. It was filled with sunlight in the mornings, the smell of turpentine and old canvas a comforting constant. She loved the stillness of her work, the meditative focus it required, the quiet beauty of giving something broken a second chance. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, reality crept in. The weight of her past, the choices she'd made, the people she'd trusted, coiled around her like a snake. She could still hear her mother's voice, brittle with disappointment, reminding her of everything she'd lost when she left their idyllic countryside estate years ago. The security, the future, the man her family had chosen for her, a suitable match with an impeccable lineage. Instead, Isabella had chosen passion, and it had nearly destroyed her. It was him, Marcus Voltaire, the name she couldn't say aloud without tasting blood and smoke, without feeling the phantom grip of his hands on her skin, both tender and cruel, a contradiction she could never escape. He had swept into her life like a hurricane, with eyes like storm clouds and a voice that could make her knees weak. Against her better judgment, she had given him everything, and he had taken more than she ever thought possible. She thought she'd escaped him. In the years since, she'd rebuilt herself brick by brick, wall by wall. But even now, in moments of solitude, she felt his shadow pressing against her, whispering her name in the dark corners of her mind. The present day, a new threat looms. The townhouse door slammed shut, snapping her back to reality. It was Emily, her closest friend and the only person Isabella trusted implicitly. The blonde was soaked from head to toe, her raincoat dripping onto the floor as she wrestled with a bag of groceries. "You look like you've been haunting the place," Emily teased, dropping the bag on the counter. "And for the record, if you don't stop overthinking, I'll drag you out to dinner, whether you like it or not." Isabella managed a weak smile, but Emily's brow furrowed. "Seriously, Isa, what's going on? You've been off these last few weeks. Did something happen?" "No," Isabella lied, turning back to the window. "Just tired, that's all." But something had happened. The bloodied envelope she'd found this morning, its contents still burned in her mind, had been a message, a warning. Marcus was back, and he was coming for her. The phone on the counter buzzed, and Isabella flinched. Emily's gaze narrowed, but she didn't press. As Isabella reached for it, her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. The message on the screen was brief. "Did you miss me?" No name, no number, but she didn't need either to know who it was. Setting and mood. Outside, the rain fell harder, drumming against the windows like a heartbeat. The townhouse, usually warm and welcoming with its soft lighting and cozy furnishings, now felt oppressive. Shadows gathered in the corners, and every creak of the old wooden floors set her nerves on edge. Isabella glanced at the clock on the wall. Time was slipping away, and she knew it wouldn't be long before the life she had built so carefully came crashing down once more. The question was, could she survive it this time? Would you like to explore her relationships further? Add more depth to her backstory, or emphasize the tension building in her world? Let me know. Build-up, conflict and rising tensions. Isabella couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next few days, the city felt unfamiliar, its once familiar streets twisting into something darker. Each shadow stretched too long, each passerby too curious. She wasn't paranoid, was she? Her art studio, her sanctuary became her only refuge. She poured herself into the latest project, restoring a Renaissance painting nearly ruined by time and neglect. The soft hum of the lamps, the delicate brushstrokes, it was the only thing keeping her tethered. But even here, she felt it, the slow, insidious unraveling of her piece. Then came the first sign. It was late, the studio quiet, when the bell on the front door chimed. Startled, Isabella glanced at the clock, 10:13 p.m. "Emily?" she called, but the silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. She stepped toward the door, her pulse quickening, and found it slightly ajar. A cold gust swept inside, carrying the scent of rain and something metallic. On the threshold lay a single black rose. Her throat tightened. She didn't need to look closer to know it was him. Marcus had always left roses, tokens of his obsession. But the black ones came with a message. "You're mine, no matter the cost." Isabella slammed the door and locked it, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. Marcus Voltaire returns. The next morning, the rain had given way to a grey, sullen sky. Isabella tried to focus, but her mind was elsewhere. She replayed the night over and over, questioning her sanity. Had she locked the door earlier? Had she imagined the rose? "Are you all right, Miss Marlowe?" asked James, the gallery owner who frequently commissioned her work. He was in his mid-40s, a steady presence with an easy smile that had always put her at ease. "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a smile, but James's expression turned grim as he handed her a folder. "I thought you should see this." Inside were photographs, her townhouse, her studio. Even a candid shot of her at a cafe. Each one was dated, and the timestamps told her they weren't old. Someone had been following her. "Who gave you these?" she demanded, her voice rising. "They were mailed to the gallery. No return address." Her fingers tightened on the folder. This wasn't just intimidation. It was Marcus's way of reminding her that he could reach her anywhere. The first confrontation. That evening, Isabella returned home to find her living room bathed in candlelight. Her chest tightened as she stepped inside. The candles weren't hers, and neither was the figure waiting for her. Marcus stood in the center of the room, a glass of red wine in hand. He looked every bit the predator she remembered. Dark suit, perfectly tailored, his sharp features softened by the flickering light. "Isabella," he drawled, his voice like silk and smoke. "You've been avoiding me." Her first instinct was to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. "How did you get in here?" He raised an eyebrow, amused. "The better question is, why would I need to break in? This was always our home, wasn't it?" "This was never our home," she snapped, finding her voice. "You need to leave." He stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne triggering memories she'd buried long ago. "You don't mean that. You can't mean that. I've waited years for you, Isabella, years. And now here we are." Her hand curled into a fist, nails biting into her palm. "You waited years to do what? Stalk me." Threaten me. Whatever this is, it's over, Marcus. It's been over. But he smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of his lips. You don't get to decide when it's over. You never did. The air between them crackled with tension, a volatile mix of fear and the undeniable pull that had once bound them together. After Marcus left, Isabella collapsed onto the floor, shaking. She wanted to call the police, but what would she say? That her ex-lover had shown up uninvited? That he'd left roses and cryptic messages? It wasn't enough, not for someone like Marcus, who knew how to twist the system to his advantage. The next day, she confided in Emily, who was furious. You need to go to the police, Isa, she insisted. This isn't some stupid romantic gesture. It's dangerous. I know, Isabella admitted, her voice small, but Marcus, he's not just anyone. He's powerful, connected. If I go to the police, he'll know, and it'll only make things worse. Emily's frustration was palpable. So what's the plan? Wait for him to decide what he's going to do next? Isabella didn't have an answer. Her growing isolation was another weight on her shoulders. James distanced himself after the photographs, suddenly reluctant to work with her. Friends she hadn't spoken to in years were unreachable. It was as if Marcus's presence was already erasing the life she'd fought so hard to rebuild. Escalation, the stakes are raised. Days later, Isabella returned to her studio to find it ransacked. Canvases were slashed, brushes broken, and the painting she'd been working on, the centerpiece of her next exhibit, was ruined. On the back of the frame, written in thick black ink, were the words, "Mine, always." The message was clear. Marcus wasn't just after her heart. He wanted her submission, her life, her very soul, and he wouldn't stop until he had it. Here's a draft for the climax of your dark romance novel, featuring a dramatic turning point and a shocking twist. The climax, unveiling the twist. The storm outside matched the tempest raging within Isabella. The gallery was eerily quiet, its high ceilings amplifying her footsteps as she moved through the darkened halls. Tonight was supposed to be her night, the unveiling of her latest restoration. A chance to reclaim her name, her life, her peace. But Marcus had other plans. She found the letter hours earlier, slipped under her studio door. It had no address, no signature, but the words were as familiar as his voice. Meet me at the gallery. Midnight, alone. Emily had begged her not to go, but Isabella knew there was no avoiding this. Marcus wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted, or until she ended it herself. The confrontation. The gallery's main exhibit hall stretched before her, lit only by the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the skylights. Her restored painting hung in the center, its golden hues stark against the shadows. Marcus stood beneath it, his figure tall and commanding, a glass of wine in hand. He turned at her approach, his smile slow and deliberate. I knew you'd come, he said. This ends tonight, Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. Marcus chuckled, low and dark. You've always been dramatic. It's one of the things I loved about you. Loved, she repeated, bitterness creeping into her tone. What you did to me wasn't love, Marcus. It was control, obsession. He took a step closer, the glass in his hand catching the light. You can call it what you like, but it doesn't change the truth. You and I, Isabella, we're inevitable. I left you, she snapped. I built a life without you. And you, her voice broke as she gestured around them, you couldn't stand it, could you? That I was happy, that I was free. His smile faltered, replaced by something colder. Free? Is that what you call this charade? Hiding in your little studio, pretending to be someone else? That's not freedom, Isabella. That's fear. Before she could respond, Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. He tossed it onto a nearby table, the contents spilling out. Photographs, financial statements, and a single legal document. Do you know what this is? He asked, his tone suddenly calm. It's everything you've worked for. Your gallery contracts, your bank accounts, even your precious townhouse. All of it. Under my name. Her heart stopped. What? Marcus's smile returned, cruel and victorious. You didn't think I'd let you go without a safety net, did you? Every step you've taken, every success you've had, it's because I allowed it. I've been watching, Isabella, protecting you from the shadows. And now it's time to come home. Her knees felt weak as she stared at the papers. It wasn't possible. She'd fought so hard, done everything herself. But the proof was undeniable. Marcus had been behind her every move, orchestrating her life like a puppet master. "You're lying," she whispered. "Am I?" He stepped closer, his voice soft but deadly. "Think about it. The sudden influx of funds when you opened your studio, the anonymous buyer who commissioned your first major piece, the mysterious investor who saved your gallery from foreclosure last year. That was me, Isabella. All of it was me." Her world tilted as the truth sank in. Every victory, every step forward, it had all been a mirage, a life built on Marcus's whims. The breaking point. "You're sick," she spat, tears streaming down her face. "You've taken everything from me." "I've given you everything," he corrected, his voice rising. "And this is how you repay me? By running? By hiding? Do you know what it's been like, watching you pretend you don't need me?" "I don't need you," she screamed, her voice echoing through the gallery. The tension snapped like a live wire. Marcus lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. "You're mine, Isabella. You always have been." Her free hand found the edge of a sculpture, and without thinking, she swung it. The heavy base connected with his temple, and Marcus stumbled, blood trickling down his face. "You," he began, but his voice was cut off as he collapsed to the floor. The revelation, Isabella's transformation. For a moment, there was only silence. Isabella stared at his motionless body, her heart racing. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows. "Emily," she called, her voice trembling. Emily stepped forward, her face pale, but it wasn't fear in her eyes. It was something darker. "Emily," Isabella began, but her friend cut her off. "I warned you," Emily said, her voice low. "I told you Marcus was dangerous. But you didn't listen." "What are you talking about?" Emily's gaze hardened. "I'm talking about the fact that I've spent years cleaning up your messes, protecting you from yourself, and now, because of you, he's dead." Isabella's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? You knew?" Emily nodded, her expression unreadable. "I knew everything, and I stayed quiet because I thought you'd finally see reason. But you didn't. And now we're both in this." The weight of betrayal hit her like a freight train. Emily, her closest confidant, had been complicit all along. "What do you want from me?" Isabella whispered. Emily stepped closer, her voice a chilling whisper. "I want you to understand that you're not innocent in this. You never were. Marcus may have been obsessed, but you fed the fire. And now we both have to live with the consequences." Heightened stakes. As the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, Isabella realized the truth. She wasn't just fighting Marcus's ghost. She was fighting the web of lies and betrayals that had ensnared her entire life. And the only way out was to confront the darkest parts of herself. The parts that had drawn Marcus to her in the first place. Would you like to expand on Emily's motives or dive deeper into Isabella's emotional state after this reveal? Let me know how you'd like to shape the climax further. Here's a draft for the resolution and redemption phase of your dark romance novel, offering closure and reflection for the protagonist. Resolution and redemption. The police arrived minutes after the chaos, their lights flashing against the gallery's stained glass windows. Isabella stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling as they hovered over Marcus's motionless body. Emily had vanished into the shadows, leaving her to face the aftermath alone. The officers questioned her, their voices distant as she struggled to process everything. She told them the truth, or at least part of it, that Marcus had broken into the gallery, that he had threatened her, that she acted in self-defense. Her story held. The authorities chalked it up to a tragic accident, and Marcus's body was taken away, leaving the gallery eerily silent once more. But Isabella knew the truth was far more complicated. A time for reflection. The days that followed were a blur. Isabella returned to her townhouse, its once cozy interior now a hollow shell of what it had been. The black rose Marcus had left on her doorstep still lingered in a vase on the mantel, its petals dry and brittle. She spent hours replaying the events, the choices she'd made, and the people she'd trusted. Marcus's obsession, Emily's betrayal, her own role in the web of manipulation and control. It was a labyrinth of guilt, anger, and heartbreak. But somewhere in the tangled mess, she began to see the faintest glimmers of clarity. Marcus was gone, but his shadow no longer loomed as large as it once had. She wasn't the same woman who had fallen under his spell all those years ago. She had survived, and now she had to decide what came next. Facing Emily. Emily didn't make it easy. She avoided Isabella for weeks, ignoring her calls and texts. But Isabella wasn't willing to let their story end in silence. She found Emily in a small cafe on the edge of the city, her face drawn and pale. "You shouldn't be here," Emily said, as Isabella slid into the seat across from her. "We need to talk," Isabella replied. Emily laughed bitterly. "Talk about what? How everything fell apart? How we destroyed the one person who had control over us both?" Isabella flinched but held her ground. "You're right. We both made mistakes. But that doesn't excuse what you did. Hiding things from me, enabling Marcus. You were supposed to be my friend. And you were supposed to be smarter," Emily shot back, her voice sharp. "You think I wanted this? Do you know how many nights I stayed awake, wondering if he'd come for you, or me? I kept quiet, because I thought I was protecting you." "You weren't," Isabella said softly. "You were protecting yourself." The words hung heavy between them. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time she looked vulnerable. "Maybe you're right," she admitted, "but I'm not the only one who needs to own up to their part in all this." Isabella nodded. "I know. That's why I'm here." The conversation ended without resolution, but it was a start, a crack in the wall that had formed between them. Reclaiming her life. In the months that followed, Isabella began to rebuild. Not the life she had before, but something entirely new. She sold the townhouse, unable to shake the memories etched into its walls, and moved into a smaller, sunlit apartment closer to her studio. She spent long hours restoring paintings, pouring her pain and hope into her work. The gallery's director invited her to curate an exhibit showcasing her restorations, a project that reignited her passion. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to someone else's expectations or control. Letting go of the past. One crisp autumn morning, Isabella visited Marcus's grave. The cemetery was quiet, the trees shedding their leaves in gentle whispers. She stood before the simple stone marker, a bouquet of white lilies in her hand. "I don't know if you ever loved me," she said aloud, her voice steady, "or if you even knew what love was. But I know this. I loved you once, and it almost destroyed me." She placed the flowers on the grave, their fragrance mingling with the cool air. "You don't own me anymore. You never did." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the weight of Marcus's memory behind her. A bittersweet hope. Isabella didn't believe in neat, happy endings. Life was messier than that. But as she stood in her studio one evening, the golden light of the setting sun streaming through the windows, she felt something she hadn't in years: peace. She wasn't the same woman she'd been when Marcus entered her life. She wasn't the woman he had tried to control, or the woman who had fought so hard to escape him. She was something new, stronger, wiser, and finally free. As she picked up her brush and turned to the blank canvas before her, she smiled. This was her story now, and for the first time, she was the one holding the pen. Would you like to explore a specific character's resolution further or add more depth to the ending? Let me know how you'd like to refine this conclusion. Here's a draft for the conclusion and audience engagement section of your dark romance story. Conclusion and audience engagement. As the final brushstrokes of Isabella's journey come into view, we're left with a haunting yet hopeful portrait of resilience, redemption, and the power of reclaiming one's life. Isabella's story is a reminder that even in the shadow of manipulation, betrayal, and heartbreak, there lies a path to healing. It's not a simple journey, healing rarely is, but it's one that begins with the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful, and the strength to take the first step toward freedom. In her darkest moments, Isabella found herself tested in ways she never imagined. She confronted her past, unraveled the web of lies that bound her, and stood firm against the forces that sought to control her. Through it all, she discovered something priceless: her own worth. Her story encourages us to ask ourselves, how do we recognize the invisible chains that hold us back? What does it take to rewrite a life built on someone else's terms? And how can we find the courage to let go of the past to make room for the future? This dark romance serves as a powerful metaphor for the battles we all face, whether it's against toxic relationships, self-doubt, or the fear of change. It's a story about transformation, about shedding the layers of who we were to become who we're meant to be. Call to action. Now it's your turn. What would you do if you found yourself in Isabella's shoes? Could you confront the shadows of your past, even if it meant risking everything? Or would the weight of those secrets hold you back? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you found Isabella's journey compelling, don't forget to give this story a like and share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own strength. And if you're craving more tales of passion, conflict, and redemption, make sure to subscribe and explore our other dark romance stories. Every story has a lesson to teach, a message to carry. Isabella's story reminds us that no matter how dark the night, the dawn always comes, and with it, the chance to start again. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep seeking the light in the darkness. Does this wrap-up feel impactful and engaging to you? Let me know if there's anything you'd like to adjust or emphasize further. Here's how the storytelling techniques can be woven into the narrative while adhering to your instructions.